So I wanted to take a look at this Vox video that I found about the state of gun violence in the U.S. Explained in 18 charts. And I'm just going to go ahead and skip about 22 seconds in and get right to the data. Now, before we get started on this, I think it's important to identify terms, because throughout this video, we'll be alternating between different terminology, and you'll need to keep in mind when they use these terms exactly what they mean by that. First, we'll start off with the most general term, homicide, which is the intentional killing of one person by another. With homicide, you've got to keep in mind that the FBI separates homicide into several more specific terms, but the most important ones are criminal homicide, or as they'll refer to it in their graphs, murder, and justifiable homicide, which includes cases such as self-defense or the killing of a person in the process of committing a felony by the police or by a private citizen. The next term is mass shooting or mass killing. Obviously, a shooting refers specifically to the mass killings involving the use of a firearm, while mass killing refers to any killing which includes a certain number of victims. The problem with mass shooting and mass killing terminology is that there is no legal definition of the term, and what that means may vary dependent upon who is doing the study in question, and it may vary across country lines as well. And next there's gun deaths, which is simply the death of anyone for any reason by firearm. There might be more terminology that I need to go over. I can't remember. If there is, then I'll go over it once we get to it, but I'm pretty sure that's all of it.
It's true that the US sees many more mass shootings than these other developed countries. Between 2000 and 2014, there were 133 mass shootings in public populated places. That's excluding gang violence and terrorism.
Why exclude gang violence and terrorism? Do people killed by gangsters and terrorists not matter? I mean, I do get the argument against including terrorism, but only if it was a foreign attacker. I mean, if the argument for the exclusion is that gang violence and terrorism can't be prevented by stricter gun control, then it should follow that all shootings in which illegally obtained firearms were used should also be excluded. I also find the exclusion of such shootings, presumably on that basis, to be in itself an argument against the validity of gun control regulations as a preventative measure to shootings. Now, to be clear, I'm not opposed to gun control laws, but I do believe it is silly to assume that anyone intent on committing a crime feels any obligation to obey such laws, and therefore the laws are not a valid preventative measure. This, I think, is one of the major misunderstandings of the purpose of any law. Laws do not prevent crime. Laws exist to provide a standard by which we all have agreed to live for general prosperity.
Of course, the US is a much larger country, but if you adjust for population size, it still ranks higher.
Okay, so this is presumably the source that they were using for these stats. It says Shield, Kraut, and Alsace, which you'll note in the video is exactly the source that they list, as well as this being from PolitiFact, which again is what they list. Now, interesting to note would be that the only countries that they look at in this article are the United States, Australia, Canada, China, England, Finland, France, Germany, Mexico, Norway, and Switzerland. They apparently in the study did look at less developed countries, but they were excluded from this article. So if we take a look at my source, it seems to just be comparing the US to 16 European countries from 2009 to 2015, and it is comparing the annual death rate from mass public shootings and the frequency of mass public shootings. Admittedly, my source only looks at the data from 2009 to 2015, so that might account for the discrepancy between the information that they provided and the information I provided. Okay, so where we left off, they said that accounting for population, the U.S. still ranks higher, But if we look at this, we see that this is frequency per million people from mass public shootings from 2009 to 2015, so it is being adjusted for population, and the US is still number 12. A few of the countries that they list are below the US on this, but a few of the countries they list are also above the US on this. And going back to their PolitiFact source, we'll see this statement. Still, the US doesn't rank number 1 at 0.15 mass shooting fatalities per 100,000 people. The US had a lower rate than Norway, 1.3 per 100,000, Finland, 0.34 per 100,000, and Switzerland, 1.7 per 100,000. I think it's important to note that this is talking about mass shooting fatalities, not the frequency of mass shootings. But since we're on the topic of mass shooting fatalities, let's take a look at my source again. So as you'll see here, the US has managed to move up to the 11th spot for mass shooting fatalities, but that still doesn't put it at the top of the list, with some of the countries listed by Vox still being both above and below the US in ranking. Next, they say this: Alsace warned PolitiFact of a few caveats about the data. While they believe their database to be among the most exhaustive compilations available, Alsace noted that it may not include every instance of mass shootings. It also doesn't include every example of mass killings, just those committed by firearms, even though mass stabbings are not uncommon in such places as China. Finally, their database doesn't include acts generally considered to be terrorism, such as the attack in Paris on the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. If those were included, we are likely to see something much different statistically, as there have been a number of very high-profile terrorist attacks in Europe, some including the use of firearms, that are excluded from the current analysis, she said. But in all likelihood, this would only make the case against Obama's claim stronger. Now, I'll admit that my source does include terrorist attacks in its statistics, and that the Crime Prevention Research Center, does seem to have a strong bias. As I said earlier, I don't really agree with the exclusion of gang violence and terrorism in these statistics. But if my earlier assumption is correct, that the stats are excluded because they are believed to be shootings which could not be prevented by more strict laws, then I think it would be important to look at the Charlie Hebdo attacks they mention in the article, just as an example. As I said earlier, I kind of understand excluding foreign attacks because a country has no regulation over foreign gun control policy. But here we can see that police quickly identified brothers Saeed Kouachi, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, and Sharif Kouachi, again, don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, French citizens born in Paris to Algerian immigrants. So they were French citizens. They lived in France and had to adhere to French gun control policy. The weapons used in the attacks were supplied via the Brussels underworld, according to the Belgian press. A criminal sold Ahmedi Koulibaly the rocket-propelled grenade launcher and Kalashnikov assault rifles that the Kouachi brothers used. And for some context into Belgium's ranking in the world for guns per capita, Belgium ranks number 35 at 17.2 guns per 100 people.
Of these countries, Finland is next, with just 2 shootings over 14 years, but a much, much smaller population.
So, as we saw from their own source, although it places the US at the top of their list of developed countries for mass shooting frequency, it doesn't place the US at the top of their list for mass shooting fatalities. And keep in mind that although my source includes terrorist attacks, their source didn't, yet it still didn't place the US at the top of their list for mass shooting fatalities. My source, the Crime Prevention Research Center, places the US in the 12th spot for mass shooting frequency when compared to European nations over the past 6 years, and the 11th spot for fatalities.
And this type of tragedy seems to be happening more often in the US. Each of these squares represents a public mass shooting with 4 or more fatalities.
I don't like that you've decided to represent this with squares. It makes it very difficult to distinguish one mass shooting from the next. Although I'm pretty sure that was probably entirely intentional.
Before 2011, they happened 6 months apart on average. But since then, only 2 months go by between them.
So again, looking at the source you provided, the Mother Jones and Harvard School of Public Health, we can see that there aren't 200 days between shootings before 2011. But that much should be obvious just from looking at your graph. You've decided to total all the mass shootings over a 19-year period and average them out, then compare that to the average time between shootings over a 4-year period. I'll admit that there were fewer shootings before 2011, or more accurately before 2005. But I'd consider this to be a dishonest representation of the frequency of mass shootings, especially since it excludes gang violence. Are we to believe that you don't consider victims such as Dino Wooldridge, who you'll later mention in this video, to be worthy of inclusion in this timeline? The 90s had a notoriously high crime rate, particularly gang violence.
I hope and pray that I don't have to come out again during my tenure as president to offer my condolences to families in these circumstances.
That was October 1st, 2015, and just about 2 months later...
And just about 2 months later, he comes out to talk about a terrorist attack, something you've been rather insistent upon excluding from your studies up until this point. I guess it was just fucking convenient this time, huh?
Yesterday, a tragedy took San Bernardino. Our first order of business is to send our thoughts and prayers to the families of those who've been killed.
Public mass shootings get all the attention because they're often so indiscriminate. But the truth is, mass shootings are unlike most gun deaths in America.
I'll give credit where it's due. This next part is actually pretty honest, but I do have a small problem with it, which I'll address after I let it play through. If you happen to be just listening to this video rather than watching it, I suggest you watch this next part.
Here's how it breaks down. According to the most recent data, 92 people are killed with guns every day on average. About 30 of those are homicides, of which maybe 1.5 at most can be considered part of mass shootings. Most of those killed, 58 people a day, are suicides.
Now, they've done something interesting here, which I think was to intentionally try and get you to confuse the statistics by writing the word homicide on the graph as they say the number 92, even though the number 92 is referring to gun deaths in total. And then they write the word mass shooting as they are saying gun homicides. And then they continue on to talk about the suicides by firearms, and they write that as they're actually saying the correct statistic for that, which is 58 per day. So I think that they're intentionally using visual cues throughout this section in order to try and get you to confuse the statistics. And the reason why I think they're doing that is because when I went to investigate this, I found that I had the numbers confused in my own mind, and I had to re-watch it to figure out exactly what they were saying. Now, I don't know, maybe I'm just a more visual learner than most people. Maybe this only works on people that learn visually. But I found, for some reason, to me, it just seems like that was probably intentional. Especially when you consider that throughout the entire video, this is the only point at which they use visual cues that aren't in sync with what they're actually saying. Now, just for the sake of showing the CDC stats and verifying that they are correct, here's the table that they are referencing from the 2013 study.
and it shows that there are 21,175 intentional self-harm suicide by discharge of firearms. I think important to note is the attempted suicide or intentional self-harm by other and unspecified means is 19,974. It's not that much less. And then the assault homicide by discharge of firearms is 11,208. And if you take the 11,208 and divide that by 365, you will come up with 30. So that would be an average of 30 homicides by discharge of firearms per day. And then if you take the 21,175, divide that by 365, you'll also come up with 58. So that is also accurate in that they say there are an average of 58 gun suicides per day.
Those suicides, they show up in international comparisons too. These are the 10 countries ranked highest on human development by the UN. The US has the highest suicide rate among them, and this darker bar shows how many of those are with guns.
Although the US is still the top of that list, I'm coming up with different rankings for suicides.
Now, here I'm showing all of the countries which rank higher than the US in suicide rates, according to the World Health Organization, or WHO. Now, the WHO website isn't very well laid out for finding this data, and you can't sort it by rate per 100,000. So this part I used the Wikipedia article, which cites the same WHO source that Vox cited, and can be sorted by rates, so I'm going to use it for convenience. Now, by the UN's Human Development Index, which they use to justify the inclusion of only the top 10 developed countries in the world, South Korea ranks number 17, Japan 20, Belgium 21, Finland 24, Iceland 16, Estonia 30, Czech Republic 28, Slovenia 25, and France 22. This puts all those countries in the category of very high human development, at which the difference between one country and the next is pretty marginal. And it puts them in the top 50 developed countries of the world. And all of these countries rank higher than the US in suicide rates. Now, as I'm sure we all know by now, the United States ranks number 1 in the world for guns per capita, yet it ranks number 50 for suicide rates in the world. So I don't consider the point that guns cause more suicides to be a very valid point, considering every single one of those countries above the United States on that list of suicide rates has to have less guns per capita than the United States. Some of them have far less, such as Japan. They're one of the lowest ranking guns per capita countries in the world.
Some people think suicide isn't really relevant to the gun issue.
Well, based on the graph you just showed us, all the other countries have almost as much suicide as the United States without the benefit of guns. Are you implying that people wouldn't be killing themselves had they not had guns? Because judging from the rate of suicide from the other countries, that doesn't seem to be the case.
But the methods that people use are important because suicide attempts often stem from temporary crises. The vast majority of people who survive suicide attempts don't end up dying from suicide, but guns make it nearly impossible to get that second chance.
This was a point I originally agreed on because I had heard that most people who attempt suicide never try it again. And I'd also heard of people who attempted suicide by means such as jumping off a building, and those who survived say that they regret trying to kill themselves as they are falling. But looking at the CDC figures for gun suicides and suicides by other means indicates that people are almost as successful in killing themselves even when they don't use guns. And the graph you just showed us comparing suicide rates between countries shows that people commit suicide almost as often, even being deprived of guns.
The victims of gun suicides are overwhelmingly men and mostly white.
Yeah, it's not really related to the gun argument, but I couldn't help bringing it up. I mean, liberals are always talking about people with privilege not being aware of that privilege. Maybe white females, black males, and black females experience some privilege that white males do not, and that is what's causing white males to commit suicide at greater rates.
And the rate of gun suicides has been increasing in the US. At the same time, the rate of gun homicides has been decreasing, especially since the 90s when crime rates in general were higher.
Yep, that is true. As you can see, this is a report from the CDC from July 12th, 2013. And it's the homicide rates among persons aged 10 to 24 years. And the reason for that is because homicide disproportionately affects people at age range 10 to 24 years. And as you can see here, homicide rates kind of peaked around 1993. Then there's a decline, and then it goes up a little bit again around 2006, and then it declines again. I would have shown the homicide rates among all age groups on that 20-year period, but unfortunately I just couldn't find that graph. Also, I wouldn't really say that suicide rates are increasing. I mean, from your graph, it's a little bit above 7, then it drops down to around about 6, then it goes back up to 7 again. That's not much of a change. Whereas the homicide rates, particularly among those who it most affects, people aged 10 to 24 years, was around 16 per 100,000 and then was cut in half, down to 8 over the next decade, and it's still declining.
But if you compare the US to other developed countries, it doesn't look like good news. These are homicides adjusted for population size. The US would probably have a higher homicide rate even without guns, but you can see how gun violence pushes that rate far beyond the other countries here.
Now, I'm not going to claim that it's okay that the United States has as high a homicide rate as it does. But here's me just scrolling through the UNODC's rankings for the highest homicide rates in the world. And the United States has the highest guns per capita in the world, yet all these countries rank higher. So it should be very obvious that there are many factors to consider when we're talking about the problem of, and I'm not even going to say gun violence because I think it's stupid to be so specific as to only consider gun violence as the form of violence that matters. All violence matters. I mean, just as an example of some of the factors that need to be considered, some of the most common circumstances among people that commit high rates of crime are high poverty. They live in high density urban areas, and oftentimes they were raised by a single parent, usually only their mother.
Now, I'm just going to assume that the implication here is that gun violence results in more fatalities than a knife, for example, because it's a more deadly weapon. I can agree that guns are more deadly weapons and thus could result in more homicides, but I'm not sure you or anyone else could know exactly how much more strict gun laws or a ban on guns could decrease homicide rates in the US, or if it even would. To illustrate this, let's just look at the homicide rates for England and Australia. So here's a graph of the homicide rates in the UK from the Office for National Statistics. As you can see, there's an increase in homicide rates in the UK until it peaks around 2003. Then it starts to decline. In 1997, handguns were banned in the UK after a mass shooting, and as you can see, it is after that point that the homicide rates in the country see its sharpest increase. Now, I'm not so foolish as to say that this was the result of the handgun ban. Correlation is not causation, and I make no assumptions about the cause of the increase in homicides or even about the decrease after 2003. And here you can see the homicide rates in Australia from the Australian Institute of Criminology. Much like with the UK, Australia instituted a gun ban in 1996 and the gun buyback program, which purchased any guns which were made illegal from the citizens. Unlike with the UK, we don't see a sharp incline after the ban, and we start to see some decline after 1999. Again, I make no assumptions about the causes of the increases or decreases in homicides in either country, but remember that the decline in homicides in either country is paralleled by the decline in homicides in the US. My point here is that by comparing the US to these other countries which instituted more strict gun laws, we can't claim that guns, in your words, push the homicide rates beyond other countries, because if they did, that would be evident in the countries which instituted such bans.
The victims of these shootings, they're not the ones you often see on the national news. They're disproportionately young black men.
Again, like with white male suicides, maybe there is some privilege experienced by all but black men, which results in them being far more likely to be the victims of gun violence. Personally, I don't believe in racial or gender privilege. I'm just using the terminology common in progressive rhetoric. To be clear, that doesn't mean that I don't believe that racism or sexism exist. What I mean is that I don't believe that an entire race or gender can be said to universally experience privilege. To do so would be committing a composition fallacy, and ignores that individuals can exist which may experience or perpetuate racism. Just because white men may disproportionately commit suicide does not mean that all white men must experience some hardship which causes them to commit suicide. And just because black men are disproportionately the victims of homicide, that doesn't mean that all black men must experience some hardship unique to them.
You guys can leave here and go on with your lives, but we gotta go on to empty rooms. Because our children's lives were taken away by people who should not have had guns anyway.
Okay, so here's where they're talking about Dino Wooldridge, which I had mentioned earlier when I was criticizing them for excluding gang mass shootings because, you know, in order to do that, they'd have to be excluding this. And here they're including it. So it's sort of a similar situation to when they included San Bernardino, even though prior to this point, they've again been rather insistent upon excluding gang violence from their statistics. So I'm just going to go through this real quick. Gang members sprayed bullets into a Chicago City park last week, injuring a 3-year-old boy and 12 other people, after one of them had been grazed by a bullet hours earlier, police said on Tuesday. Now, that they say sprayed bullets, to me indicates that they were using fully automatic weapons, which fully automatic weapons are illegal in the state of Illinois. The 4 men who are being held without bond on charges of attempted murder were not aiming at anyone in particular, but believed that the park was controlled by a rival gang. So again, this was gang violence. There wasn't an intended individual. One of the men, Tabari Young, 22, who has been arrested more than a dozen times, used a military-grade weapon in the shooting. Again, that seems to be an indicator that they were using a weapon that is illegal by Illinois law.
One possible explanation is that the US simply has more crime than those other countries. But if you set aside homicides for a moment and look at rates of burglary or assault, you don't see that same spike that you see with homicide.
I have a few problems with this point, and the first is that burglary is not a good way to gauge homicides. Burglary is entry into a building illegally with intent to commit a crime, especially theft. Now, I'm pretty sure that typically burglars want to enter into a building during a time when it isn't occupied. They want to avoid confrontation because it makes theft a little difficult, especially if they have to shoot someone to do it, and thus risk alarming anyone in the neighborhood and get caught. I'm pretty sure they usually scout out homes in preparation in order to make sure they can commit the theft with minimum resistance and risk. And here we can actually see that. This is a table from the FBI. It's actually from their website, and it's reporting on the circumstances of murders. And here you can see that burglary only makes up 94 of the total 12,253 murder victims. Now, this is just the top half of this table, which goes over the causes for murder that are related to felonies, and burglary is the fourth highest among them, but it's still relatively small compared to the top three, which are robbery, narcotic drug laws, and other non-specified, whatever the fuck that means. And here's the bottom half of that table, which goes over the other than felony causes of murder. And you can see that the highest ones are other arguments. Again, not sure exactly what that means. And other not specified. Not very clear what that means. There's brawl due to influence of alcohol, resulting in 93 murders. Brawl due to influence of narcotics, which caused 59 murders. And argument over money or property, which caused 133. Then there's the gang-related ones. The gangland killings, which are 138, and juvenile gangland killings, or juvenile gang killings, which is 584. Okay, so I went to the UNODC's website to verify what they show in the video regarding burglary rates and assault rates in all these countries. And what they state in the video is in fact accurate, at least by the UNODC standard. So here I'm looking at the robbery rates for all the countries that they listed, because as you'll remember, the FBI put robbery as the highest cause of murder in the United States. So here we go, just me looking through the robbery rates, putting it all down on a notepad, and at the end I will put up a graph that shows the comparison between all the countries and their robbery rates. I also tried to look into the drug crime in all these countries, but as I'm sure you're aware, many of them being in Europe, they don't really have strict drug laws like we do in the US, so to do so just seemed useless. I mean, obviously they're not going to have a lot of drug crime in countries where drug crimes don't really exist, and what drug crimes they do have, they don't really take it very seriously, or what crimes they do have are just regulation of what drugs they do already have legalized. So since they don't have an active drug war like we do in the US, they're not going to have that high risk, high profit drug trade that we do in the US that would make it so profitable that people are willing to commit crimes, including murder, in order to maintain their drug trade. Okay, so now that I've gathered up all the data and put it together in this graph, as you can see, the United States is the highest on that for robbery rates. And being that robbery rates caused the most deaths, according to the FBI, yeah, there's that. And again, as I was talking about, the drug trade. So Yeah, I really don't like that they decided to use burglary and assault as their only examples of crimes. They try to say that there's no correlation between the crime rate in America and the murder rate, yet the only crimes they looked at were burglary and assault, which is ridiculous, especially considering that burglary isn't a huge cause of murder in the United States. I mean, it's not a small cause, but the biggest causes, as I showed, were robbery and the drug trade, and whatever the fuck that other one was that was very vague and unspecific.
Okay, so here I'm just scrolling through a list that ranks all the countries in the world based on crime rate, just a general overall crime rate, no specific crimes. I wasn't gonna go in and check each and every type of crime from I think it was the UNODC, and compare every country by each individual crime. So I just looked at this, and as you can see, the United States is the highest ranking for just overall crime rates among the countries that they listed. I couldn't remember all of the countries they listed, so I might have highlighted some countries that aren't included in their stats.
Altogether, the number of gun deaths in the US from 2000 to 2013 exceeds the number of Americans killed by AIDS, by illegal drug overdoses, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and terrorism combined.
Yeah, and automobile accidents, cigarettes, and heart disease cause way more deaths than guns. Maybe we should have far more strict regulation of driver's licenses, cigarettes, and we should tell people what they can and can't eat too. As for fewer war deaths, there's several factors to consider here. The first is that the military turns down 80% of applicants as armed forces shrink. Gone are the post 9/11 recruiting days where the US military would take just about anyone who walked through its doors, issuing waivers for misconduct and health issues. Now 80% of applicants are turned away. US Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel said in a speech that cutting the current level of 522,000 soldiers to 490,000 soldiers by autumn of 2015 was necessary to protect critical capabilities like special operations forces and cyber resources. Fewer spaces means tough choices for recruiters. We're turning down twice as many as before. It's not that we have a zero defect mentality, because we don't. But it's true that the quality of military recruits right now is the highest it's been in 40 years. Most young Americans are ineligible to join the military, either because they're drug users, obese, medically unfit, failed to graduate high school, or have criminal records. The Pentagon estimates that only 25% are qualified. 5 years ago, if a kid had gotten caught with a joint in his car, that person would be pretty much a shoo-in to enlist under a waiver. Now you're not authorized. When it comes to education, the Department of Defense considers its crop of new recruits to be high quality if 90% have a high school diploma. Federal News Radio reported last year newcomers crushed that goal, with 99.6% having graduated. So as you can see here, they're looking for fewer high-quality recruits in order to more efficiently perform operations. And as you can see here, only 25% of recruits are combatants. 43% are logistics, 18% HQ admin, and 18% life support. So that seems to indicate that there's a lot more intelligence that goes on behind the scenes of the military combatants. And this is the way that modern warfare is conducted now. We have a lot fewer people that are actually engaged in combat. We have all these intelligence officers and all this other stuff going on behind the scenes. So this way we can conduct warfare more efficiently, hopefully, more intelligently, hopefully, and have fewer lives lost. And that does seem to be the way that we've been going.
It should be clear by now that this level of gun violence is a uniquely American problem among the developed world. And here's one reason why. There are a ton of guns in the US. This chart shows the estimated number of guns by country. It's adjusted for population size, and it's still not even close.
Okay, so I think it's important to point out here that on average, 1 in 3 Americans owns a gun. So yeah, we've got a lot of guns, but also individual private owners own a number of guns. Here's a map showing where most of the gun ownership in America is, and what percentage of their population owns a gun. Also, bear in mind that in the U.S. consists of many states, each of which is more comparable to a European country, not just in terms of population, but some states have as many major cities as an entire European country. You might argue that the per capita stats average that out, but that's not fair when you look at low population, low crime states. In my opinion, a much more fair way to look at this would be to compare the EU to the US. But we do have states with incredibly low crime rates and populations which are comparable to European countries that also have low crime rates and low population. But when you take high crime, high population states and distribute that over the whole country, it's, in my opinion, just an unfair representation. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'm already starting to address later points, so I'll hold off on this until later.
The question that I would like to ask is how on earth could he compile 13 guns? How can that happen?
If you take a look back at the 10 countries with the highest levels of human development, you can see that it's really easy to get a gun in the US.
Okay, so I've screen capped this and I highlighted what it says at the bottom, because in America, generally speaking, we like to avoid making things a federal law unless absolutely necessary. We like to let states decide shit like this for themselves. As I said earlier, each American state is more comparable to a European country than the entirety of the United States, because some states might institute one or even all of these gun control policies. I'm not sure if any states actually require safety training or safe storage, and I'm not going to look through the gun laws of each individual state. That would take fucking forever, so might be possible, but I know for a fact there are states that require licenses, registration, and giving reason for purchase.
All of the other countries require a license to purchase most guns, and those purchases are recorded into an official registry. To get that license, people have to state a reason for why they want a gun. And in most of these countries, they have to pass a safety test and are required by law to store their guns safely.
Yet none of these things can prevent people from flipping their shit and killing someone, or a group of people. Even with these laws, people still do mass shootings in those countries. Like we noted in the beginning, despite all of this, the US still doesn't rank higher than all the other countries in mass shooting frequency or fatalities.
In part because of its lax laws, there are well over 300 million guns in the US, and counting. This chart doesn't reflect private sales, but it shows the number of background checks, which all federally licensed dealers have to run. It suggests that the demand for guns has been increasing steeply since Barack Obama took office.
Yeah, I can say that I've actually known people who purchased guns even if they hadn't previously owned one when Barack Obama took office, because they were afraid that either guns were going to be banned as a whole, or the specific guns that they were interested in purchasing would no longer be available for legal purchase. Okay, so here I've taken a map from gunlawscorecard.org, which ranked all the states based on their gun control laws, and I've overlaid the map that shows gun ownership. Alabama, you can't see the ranking on it because on this map you have to have one of the states selected to show its ranking, and Alabama is an F. But as you can see, generally speaking, yeah, low-ranked states do, generally speaking, have more guns. But not necessarily. There are also a lot of states that have low rankings, but don't have a lot of guns.
So we've looked at gun deaths and at gun ownership. This chart puts them together. It shows that among highly developed countries, the more guns in a country, the more gun deaths.
Okay, so notice the terminology they're using here. They're saying gun deaths. So that includes suicides. And as you'll remember, the U.S. is far from the top of the list of suicides. There are a lot of other countries that rank much higher on suicides. Remember this graph? That black bar for gun suicides for the U.S. is being included in their graph for gun death rate and gun ownership by population. And of course, the problem with this is the assumption that those suicides wouldn't have happened had those people not owned guns, which, as we've shown already, that's not the case. And you can almost see that just from looking at this graph itself.
You can see that countries like Switzerland, which have relatively more guns than a country like the Netherlands, also have a higher gun death rate. And here's the US.
Now here's this spiffy-ass graph that I made showing the gun ownership rates in comparison to the homicide rates. Now, I'm no statistician. I don't understand how to plot a fitted line. I was trying to figure out how to do it. I'm not good at math. I don't know statistics or anything like that. But I just plotted this all on this graph to show what it would look like if they were to show gun ownership rates in comparison to homicide rates. And here's yet another spiffy graph that I made showing the comparison between gun ownership rates and overall crime rates. It's a little harder to draw a conclusion from this one. The data just seems to be a little bit all over the place here. Maybe if I were to plot more points than just the 10 countries that they include from their highest human development. But just judging from what I've seen looking at those tables to begin with, I'm pretty sure it would just look even more fucking chaotic if I were to put all that shit on there. I'm sure you could draw no conclusions from that data.
Likewise, US states with more guns have more gun homicides. There are outliers like Idaho, which has higher rates of gun ownership but low rates of gun murders. But overall, there's a correlation between gun ownership and homicide rates.
Again, notice the terminology here. They specifically say gun homicide. So they're not looking at overall homicides. They're looking specifically at gun homicides. So they don't care if you were stabbed to death or beaten with a baseball bat or some shit like that. You don't matter. Only the people that were shot mattered. Because if you only count the people that were shot, then you can very clearly create a correlation between gun ownership and, of course, gun-specific homicides. And as noted earlier, by the FBI's definition of homicide at least, a homicide doesn't necessarily imply that it was the unlawful killing of somebody. That in its is specifically criminal homicide or murder. And then there's also justifiable homicide, which is self-defense, shooting by a police officer that was shooting someone in the process of committing a felony, or shooting by a private citizen that was stopping someone in the process of committing a felony.
And that relationship has held up in studies that control for things like poverty, unemployment, and crime.
Okay, so here I want to get into more specific data than just broadly people in this state own this more guns. This looks specifically at who owns guns. This is from the Pew Research Center. So generally, more males than females. Generally, they are owned by more white people than blacks or Hispanics. More guns tend to be owned by people 50 and over. more guns tend to be owned by people in rural areas than in urban and suburban areas. I assume the children's section shows the age ranges of the children of gun owners, if they have any. Then there's party, tends to be a lot of Republicans and independents that own guns. And ideology tends to be a lot of conservatives and moderates, whereas liberals don't own as many. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at violent crime rates and murder rates based on population density in whichever area you may live in. So as you can see, generally speaking, your violent crime rates and your murder rates, in fact all of your crime rates, seem to decline as you get into lower population areas. Now that doesn't seem to make much sense if there's less guns in those urban areas. So the Pew Research Center table or graph we were looking at showed that there were less guns in urban areas, more guns in rural areas. But as you can see from this, the closer you get to those low population rural areas, the less violent crime, the less murder, the less of all these crimes you get.
The correlation between gun ownership and gun deaths is even stronger for suicides. It makes sense. Depression with a gun is more dangerous than depression without one.
You know, I'm not even going to do any research on this point because I've already made so many arguments against this suicide point throughout the video already. Nobody's rights are being infringed upon by somebody committing suicide. We know that correlation does not equal causation, and that's especially evident when you look at other countries, for example, that have higher suicide rates without the benefit of guns. And we saw that people are as likely to kill themselves with or without a gun. There's just been so many fucking points that we've already made on this. I'm getting lazy and tired and bored with this fucking video. I just want to get it over with.
Likewise, fights, domestic disputes, road rage, drunkenness, all much more dangerous with a gun than without.
Not necessarily. Refer back to the points on England and Australia. I'm getting fucking sick of this. Next point.
That said, you might need different policies to keep guns away from potential mass shooters than you would to keep them out of inner city gangs or out of the hands of someone who might hurt themselves. America doesn't have a gun problem. It has several of them.
These aren't fucking gun problems. Mass killings, suicide, and gang violence have existed as long as fucking humanity has. Since back when we were fucking beating each other with clubs. What the fuck are you talking about? Thank fucking God it's over. As a final point, as we said earlier, 1 in 3 Americans owns a gun. There's roughly 318.9 million Americans. That results in 106,300,000 Americans owning a gun. Now, if we take that and find what percentage of the 8,454 firearm murders that the FBI reported in 2013 those gun owners are responsible for, even though that legal gun owners probably aren't responsible for all of those 8,454 firearm murders, we'd come up with a percentage of gun owners being responsible for 0.00799% of firearm murders. Now, if blaming all gun owners for those 0.00799% of gun murders isn't a composition fallacy, then I don't know what the fuck is.